Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bristol Festival of Ideas. My name is Margaret Heffernan, and I have the pleasure of being here today with Iain Dale. Iain is the author of a new book with a very, I think, appealing title called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? A question, I think, snap. A question I think, we've all been asking of ourselves and of each other, although I think we tend to think that, the problem is always in the other person rather than with us. Iain is probably most well known for his LBC radio show, but has a really quite interesting and diverse background in politics and in talking to people about all kinds of things for all kinds of reasons in all kinds of places. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to ask Iain some questions about his book and explore some of the ideas in it. And then I'll start grabbing some of the questions that I hope you will all be putting in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screens. I can almost certainly promise I'm not going to be able to get through all of them, but I will try to voice as many of them as I can. So, Iain, I'm going to ask you a question that people often ask me about my books, which is terribly obvious, but I think always quite interesting, which is what made you write this book?
In a way, it's partly because I was asked to, but I'll tell you how it started. It was Christmas 2018, and it was at the height of all of the Brexit shenanigans. And I had been obviously covering this on my radio show for a long time, and I was getting increasingly frustrated by the extremes on both sides of the argument, and neither could see that the other one had a valid point of view. That there were so many people who seemed to think that their view was the only one, and they were right, come what may, and they would just brook no argument. And this really was on both sides. And so I started to get very frustrated by that. And I didn't actually say how I voted in the referendum until after it was over. But there's this narrative that's grown up that I've always been a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Brexiteer. Not true at all. I did vote leave, but I only decided to do so when David Cameron came back from Brussels without any meaningful renegotiated deal. And I just thought, you know what, the EU is never going to change. It's always going to be about more integration. And I didn't feel that was right for the country. And I used to do speeches for the European movement back in the 1980s. I was never somebody who was anti-Europe, but I got very frustrated with the EU as an institution. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate point of view. And I could equally argue the other side in a way. I understand why some people think we should actually be in a United States of Europe, that we should be members of the Euro. It's a perfectly legitimate argument. But many people on the sort of hard side of my side of the argument just don't understand that people do have a different view. And just as if you have the hashtag FBPE on your Twitter title, you're the Remain equivalent of the sort of very hard Brexiteers, that you cannot understand why anybody could even think of voting to leave the EU. And if you do, you're either thick or you're racist. Well, I don't think I'm thick. I know that I'm not racist. And so it was building from that. And then in the Queen's Christmas message on Christmas Day, December 2018, she effectively, without saying the words, said, why can't we all just get along? And I then got asked by the Mail on Sunday to write a column for them on this theme for their, I think it was New Year's Eve edition. And so I did. And that was really where the book started. Roll on a few months, and then Emily Maitlis, the Newsnight presenter, she published a book called Airhead, which I'm never quite sure, if you're a blonde TV presenter, whether that was a great title. But it was essentially a book of 40 different episodes in her broadcasting career, which she described. And as I started to read it, I thought, I could write this book. And so I started writing down chapter titles, things that she said would just spark off ideas in my head. And that was the book that I wanted to write. And so I phoned up my agent, and he said, it's funny you should ring today, because I've just had HarperCollins on the phone. They want you to do a book in response to James O'Brien's book. James O'Brien, for those who don't know, you all probably do, but he's also a presenter on LBC. Shall we say takes a slightly different tack to me on Brexit and many other issues. And he had written a best-selling book called How to Be Right in a World Gone Wrong. And I just said, well, if I write a book, it'll be my book. I'm not going to write a response to James. So we had a meeting. And in the end, I thought, we could combine these two ideas, because they wanted to do just something on the decline of public discourse. So what I've done is write something that it's not an autobiography, but there are autobiographical bits in it. And I've tried to sort of merge the two ideas, which so far most people seem to think I've done okay. I wasn't sure at the end whether I'd pull that off, because it could be seen as quite an awkward mix. And there's one person has spotted this dilemma in an Amazon review, and they're absolutely right. I wasn't sure whether it worked, and they said, well, they thought it just about did, but so far people have been very kind about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting. You said you're not a dyed-in-the-wool, and I thought you're actually not a dyed-in-the-wool anything, it seems to be, in the sense that
I am a West Ham supporter.
Okay, fair enough. But what I thought was quite interesting about the book is that if I had started off by trying to pigeonhole you, by the end of the book I would not have been able to.
Good.
And I that and clearly people do pigeonhole you, and they have a very kind of one-dimensional picture of you. And I just wondered, over the course of your career, are there things on which you've changed your mind, or in which you're probably still changing your mind?
There are quite a few things that I've changed my mind on. And you're right, because I once stood, this is 15 years ago, as a candidate for the Conservative Party in North Norfolk. Unfortunately, the electorate fought back. People imagine that I am just a dyed-in-the-wool Tory. Now, I would say probably up until 2010, they would have been fairly accurate in that description. Since 2010, I voted for 5 different parties. Now, admittedly, in every general election, I have voted Tory, but I voted for UKIP in the 2014 European elections. I voted for the Brexit Party in the 2019 European elections. I voted for the Liberal Democrats in a local election. I voted for the Greens in a local election, and an independent in a local election. So I would self-define as being broadly on the right, and in economic terms, I'm probably as Thatcherite as I ever have been. But in social terms, I'm not. And that is partly because of the job that I do now. I've been doing a radio show on LBC for 10 years. And that involves essentially talking to the great British public for 2 or 3 hours every single evening. And you do change your views on things. I'll give you an example. If you do a phone-in on the effects of the bedroom tax, and you have people saying, well, this is how it's affected me, you can think, well, I could argue the theory for the bedroom tax, but it's obviously been implemented wrongly. You look at universal credit, which all the parties have agreed for a long time that the theory of universal credit is absolutely right. But when you have 3 middle-aged men phoning you, one after the other, and each of them breaking down in tears on the radio, you kind of think something's gone wrong here. And so I think some of the harder edges of me have been sort of rubbed away over the years in terms of social issues. If we were having this conversation in 1985, I suspect on things like abortion, I would have been fairly pro-life. But over the years, I've come to recognize that you have to be realistic in these things, in that however much the idea of abortion is horrific, abortions have always happened for thousands of years. And so it's a bit like prostitution. If you accept that, well, you can abolish them all you like, but they won't ever be abolished. So the sensible thing is to regulate these activities in a way that broadly society finds acceptable. And you can have arguments about, well, should the term limit be 24 weeks, 22 weeks, 20 weeks, 28 weeks, or whatever? That's a sort of mere detail, but you've got to accept that you can't reverse the clock. And there are too many times when you have so-called progressive social reforms, which society then becomes used to, and then some people at the margins try and reverse them. I mean, you look at gay marriage, for example. There were dozens of Tory MPs that voted against or so-called equal marriage in, when was it, 2013, 2014. I doubt whether you would find more than a couple now that would vote to reverse it. I interviewed Anne Widdecombe recently and asked her that question, and she was almost like mortally offended that I should ask her the question, because I assumed that she would vote to roll back the clock. And she said, well, absolutely not. You can't possibly take something away from people that is being given. She said, I didn't support it at the time, but I certainly wouldn't vote to reverse it now. And I think there's been so much progress on these issues over the past 20 or 30, well, not just 20 or 30 years, probably 40 or 50 years. I was 5 years old when the death penalty was abolished, when abortion was legalized, when homosexuality was decriminalized. And over the years, I think we've become a much more accepting society, much more liberal society, using the proper use of the word liberal. And yet we've got to a point now in our public discourse where we're very illiberal, we're very intolerant of other people's views. And that has happened for all sorts of different reasons. It is partly, I think, due to social media, particularly Twitter, which I regard as a complete evil. Well, not complete evil. There are some good things about Twitter, but generally people feel free to say things on Twitter that they would never say to someone's face. Though I start the book by an anecdote. When I was at the Edinburgh Festival last year, and I was at the Adam Smith house in his drawing room, which they just renovated. It's about, 120 people present, a very sort of Radio 4 type audience. And somebody asked a question on Brexit, and I just sort of gave an opinion that I thought Brexit as well, there are threats to the country from Brexit, but there are also opportunities, and went on to explain why. And this guy in the front row started laughing. And I just said to him, why are you laughing, sir? And he said, because 90% of what you've said is absolute shit. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this, Margaret, in a meeting where somebody's actually said that to your face, but I was actually really shocked by this, because he might have been right, but it's not the sort of thing you say in those kind of environments. And the audience started to get a bit restless, and the lady behind him then asked the next question. She talked about the decline in public discourse, and I said, well, you got your prime example there, and that gentleman has just given me the first paragraph of my book. Now, I expected him at the end of the meeting to come up and say, sorry, Matt, I went a bit far there. He didn't. He just walked out. The organisers were bereft, and they then said, oh, well, if you come back next year, can we offer you a free book launch for this book? Obviously, that's gone by the by because of COVID. But it is quite astonishing the things that people will do and say now. And it is partly due to the fact that deference has disappeared in our society. Now, in many ways, that is a really good thing. I don't want to go back to a forelock-tugging society. I don't want to have a society of respecting our elders and betters just because they happen to be older than us, or just because they happen to be one notch up in the societal hierarchy. I don't want to go back to that. But there ought to be some sort of societal norms that we all accept and don't transgress. So I accept, that social media has amplified something and made it measurably, visibly worse. But it seems to me that the kind of stories that you record in your book and that we all are aware of, whether it's trolling on the internet or the kind of verbal abuse that you describe, that underneath that, it can't all be the technology and the social media, because underneath it is a real rage, just a huge kind of all-consuming rage. What do you think that's about? Well, I think it is partly because we're human beings. We are all made differently. We all think differently. We all react differently. Some people are very calm, reflective individuals. Others are just waiting for an excuse to explode. And that there is a genuine anger about some things in our society, the way that we're governed. And you see, in a way, that the rise of Trump is a perfect example of this, where a whole sector of society, or various sectors of American society, over the years have been fed this trope. Well, I don't know whether it's a trope or not, but sort of Washington is at the root of all evil, and that Washington ignores people like us. And there was a certain amount of that in the Brexit argument, if I'm honest, as well. And if people feel that they are being ignored by the people that govern them, whether it's locally or nationally, in the end, they revolt. You look at the rise of the SNP, and they would hate to admit this, but the SNP is a perfect example of a populist movement. But it has fed on the failure, particularly locally, of the Labour Party in Scotland to meet the aspirations of many sectors of Scottish society. They'd already decided they hated the Conservatives. Once they realised that Labour hadn't got the answers either, and effectively treated some groups in Scotland as client states, and Glasgow City Council is a good example of this, sort of decades of Labour rule, effectively entrenching poverty in many areas of the city. And the SNP, understandably, saw a massive political opportunity there. Now, in America, that's what Trump did. I'm not sure it was, I think he saw the opportunity to sort of get sort of the Make America Great baseball cap wearing groups. And I remember on the day of the inauguration in 2017, I was broadcasting from Washington that day, and I took my producer to the Jefferson Memorial, which I think is one of the most amazing places in the world, actually. And it's somehow very moving just standing there, and particularly when it's midnight. And I noticed this group of, I don't know, teenagers, 20-somethings, all wearing Make America Great caps. So I said to my producer, let's go and interview them. So we wandered over, and so I said who I was and where I was from. And they were fascinated at the fact that someone from England was there. And I said, well, where are you from? And they were from Alabama. And we had a really interesting chat. And I said to them, so why do you all support Donald Trump? Because he's going to make America great again. Yeah, but why? How's he going to do it? Well, he just is. There was nothing more there. They had seen him as somebody who could champion their cause, despite the fact that he was from a very different strata of society from them. And I think, therefore, these divisions that we see, not just in America, but in this country, frankly, all over the world at the moment, are understandable in many ways, because people do feel let down. But people express their views and opinions in different ways. And if you are on social media, it is so easy to do so. If you type on Twitter, Iain Dale, you're a twat, my instinct, my basic human instinct, is to instantly reply and saying, well, you're an effing twat, or something along those lines. And so the row escalates to an extent where you've both made enemies out of each other. Now, I recognized, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, that I was part of this problem, in that somebody once said, on the radio, Iain Dale is nice, nice, nice. On Twitter, he's an absolute beast. And I could only think, well, yeah, you're probably right. And I did feel I would get involved in arguments that I did not need to get involved in. I remember at midnight one night, being in bed with my laptop on my pillow, having an argument with an egg who'd got 4 followers. And I did think to myself, what on earth are you doing? And so I made a conscious decision that I wouldn't do that anymore. And I'll give you an example of how you can actually turn these things around. About 6 weeks ago, during my programme, somebody wrote on Twitter, Iain Dale is a Tory stooge, and so far at Boris Johnson's arse, you can't see his shoes. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, I might have reacted quite violently to that. But instead, I just tweeted back, you are wrong. Here are 9 examples of where I've criticised Boris Johnson or the Conservative government over the past fortnight, and then just listed them and just left it at that. And he came back for more a couple of times, and I just was fairly calm. And then the next day he DM'd me, 'cause I'm very stupid, I have my DMs open, and he said, I want to apologise. He said, I was wrong to say that. I have actually looked now at what you've said on various things, and I now see that I was completely wrong. And so over the last 6 weeks, he and I have developed this rather strange friendship online. I've never met him. He lives in Wales. Why would I? But we now sort of WhatsApp each other sort of 2 or 3 times a day. He's told me things about his personal life, which I'm pretty sure he's never told anybody else. And you think, well, and I would now regard him as a friend, even though we've never met. And I know that sounds really weird, but Twitter can bring people together as well as divide them. I remember I put a thing on Twitter. I was sorting through some papers at home, and I found a letter from somebody I used to know in Germany in 1983. We were both English language assistants. He was in Hamburg, I was in Stuttgart. And I just put on Twitter, Ray, Hamburg, 1983, English teacher. Anyone know where he is? Within half an hour, we were DMing as if the previous, 37 years, oh my God, the previous 37 years hadn't happened. So these things can be a force for good if you allow them to be, but they can be very destructive forces very, very easily.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me, part of what you're saying too is that it amplifies feelings that are already there.
Yes.
Right. And I just, I guess I go back to my original question, which is, it does seem to me there's a real rage. And in a way, maybe the lack of the death of deference kind of took the lid off of that rage. But I'm kind of interested that we're very focused on the kind of verbal violence that we see and hear. But I wonder who is doing anything meaningful to deal with the cause of the rage.
Well, I suppose it depends on what issues we're talking about. I mean, the last third of the book, or maybe more than a third, I deal with individual issues like immigration, benefits, health service, mental health. And as I was writing it, it's interesting that you asked that question, because I was thinking to myself, well, are any of these things really being addressed by the people in power at the moment, not just in this country, but around the world?
Right.
Take immigration as an example, on which, I mean, that is a subject where I have massively changed my attitudes and views. And I think it is partly because I grew up in a very conservative little village in Essex near Saffron Walden. And although I've never been anti-immigration at all, and I can genuinely say that I don't think I've ever felt a sort of racist feeling in my body. Part of that is because I grew up in this very small conservative village with a lot of black kids, because there was a children's home in the village, and so they attended the primary school. And it never occurred to me that, well, just because someone has a different color skin, so what? They're still a human being. But if you think about it, unless you live in a big city or a reasonably big town, I'd say probably 40 to 50% of the British population do not have day-to-day dealings with somebody who isn't white. And the old phrase, well, you fear things that you don't know, I think really does apply here. Not that long ago, a friend of mine rang me up and said, we've got a Muslim family moving in next door. I said, oh, right. And he said, no, you know. I said, what do you mean? No, well, you know. And basically, he was imagining that he'd got terrorists moving in next door. And I said, really? Is that the way you really think? And he said, well, you can never be too careful. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I spoke to him again. And I said, oh, how are you getting on with the neighbours then? Oh, they're fantastic. We're in and out of each other's houses all the time. And I mean, he just held these views because he'd never met a Muslim before, and had been almost subliminally indoctrinated over the years to imagine that any Muslim would be sympathetic to sort of terrorist aims. Now, you and I might think that is ridiculous and outrageous, but the more we pretend that those views sort of don't exist, the more they proliferate. And I think that has been a real problem. And I mean, racism comes in many forms. When I was a Tory candidate in Norfolk, I remember walking down Cromer High Street one day, Friday afternoon it was, and everybody seemed to be looking in the same direction. So I looked in the same direction, and there was a black man walking down the high street. Now, those people weren't being racist because they were looking at a black man. They were just looking at somebody who didn't look like them, that they hadn't really ever encountered before in a sleepy Norfolk seaside town called Cromer. You could call it casual racism, subliminal racism, I suppose, but they weren't. It was just an object of novelty for them, I suppose. Whereas over the generations, communities mix more, and these, hopefully, these sort of strange feelings die away. But people, I think, have got very angry about immigration over the years because they see that politicians have either told lies about it or haven't met whatever their concerns are. If you actually get into a deeper discussion on the issue with most people, they do recognise that we do need immigration, the economy needs immigration, but they feel that they were lied to, particularly by Blair in 2003, over the level of Eastern European immigration. And if you're a plumber or a bricklayer in this country who feels that you've been put out of work because of cheaper workers coming in from overseas, I mean, don't be surprised if people do feel rather angry about that. That isn't people being racist. It's actually they've been quite logical in their minds about it. So over the years, politicians haven't really got to grips with this issue at all. And I think when the general public looks at politicians, think, well, you've completely ignored our concerns on this. And immigration was, if you're drawing up a top 10 list of subjects that people were interested in, it wasn't Europe. Europe never appeared on these lists. It was very important to a small group of people, but it was never one of the top 10 touchstone issues. But immigration was. And even those politicians who did try to address it did it in completely the wrong way. Do you remember in 2005, the Tory election slogan is, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" Well, they had one poster which said, "It's not racist to talk about immigration. Are you thinking what we're thinking?" And I refused to have that poster in my campaign because I thought, well, it's not a good idea to have the word conservative and racist on the same poster. And just to say, "Are you thinking what we're thinking about that?" There was just a hint of a dog whistle there, I thought. And I thought that was pretty disgraceful. And you very rarely ever on the media get any programs that explain the benefits of immigration. And if people don't have this explained to them, why should they think there are any benefits? Because in their mind, most of the people who come to this country, particularly if they're illegal asylum seekers, they think that they're here to milk the benefit system. Now, all the evidence shows completely the opposite. Yes, there are people that will do that, but a very, very, very small percentage. So I remember one day on my program, I did a phone in. I just said, if you came to this country illegally, give me a call, tell me why, tell me how you did it and what you've done since. And I had a succession of people from Eritrea, from Sudan, from Syria, all over the world who had come to this country either sort of underneath a lorry from Calais. Actually, most of them were illegally coming in from Calais. And they explained why they did it. And then they told me what they were doing now and having regularized their immigration position. Most of them were in really good jobs. One of them owned a company that employed 200 people. And I could almost hear people at home thinking, oh, well, that's made me challenge my views because I thought all these people just wanted to fleece the country. And at the end of it, I said, you know, what we've heard in this hour is they did exactly what you would have done in the same situation. Whether they came here to seek asylum or even whether they were economic migrants, they did what they thought was best for them and their families. And if you look at it from that point of view, rather than viewing them as immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, if you reduce it down to the individual, I think people think about it in a different way. So I was really proud of, I got a lot of abuse for doing that. How dare you ask people who are here, who come here illegally to phone into your program? And I thought, no, I'm going to do it again. And I've done it several times since. And each time you get the same reaction from most people afterwards, saying, well, I'm really glad you did that because I learned something from that.
So, again, I think what you're talking about, which is so interesting, is we seem to have, or a lot of people seem to have, a real compulsion to demonize.
Yes. To
make things extremely black and white. And, there's a really interesting project that initiated in Germany a couple of years ago called by Die Zeit Online, which then the Mirror and Express did as Britain Speaks, where they created an app for you to declare your political perspectives. And then they called it Tinder for Politics, but it was about bringing you to.
I want it now.
Right. Except it was doing something very cunningly different. It was matching you with your polar opposite and then asking, would you like to meet face to face? And when they did this in Germany, what they found was 96% of people did meet face to face and really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Only for the 4% who didn't, their counterpart hadn't turned up, right? And a significant number of these people became very close friends. And a handful of the couples actually ended up getting married. And when the Mirror and the Express did a similar thing for a British audience, they found exactly the same results. And I just wonder, how far in something like that do you think it's about the face-to-face meeting where it's kind of harder to be really consistently nasty to somebody, and where you start to have a lot more empathy for them as a human being. So it's part of the problem. We're doing all this on radio or TV or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, but actually what we're not doing is meeting people not like us face to face.
Well, you say that, but I think things are starting to change on that. If you look at the appetite now for political debate that is face to face, you look at the Spectator, Intelligence Squared, all of these organisations that now put on shows in theatres. I mean, whatever you think of Jacob Rees-Mogg, he sold out the London Palladium. I mean, 2,000 seats. People pay, I don't know what it was, 15 or 20 quid to go.
Well, since he's my MP, I'm afraid I have rather extreme views on Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Most people do have quite defined views. And I think this is fantastic. I did 24 shows at the Edinburgh Festival last year because I'd been to the festival for a few years, and I saw Matt Ford, the comedian, doing interview shows. And he did one with the Tory MP Tim Lawton. And the place was packed. And I'm thinking, well, if Tim Lawton can pack out a place, I'm sure I can get bigger names that can get bigger audiences. So I then put on the show called Iain Dale All Talk, and the theatre promoter who I got to know, he put it on. And I had all sorts of different people, from Nicola Sturgeon, John McDonnell, Sir Nicholas Soames, Neil and Christine Hamilton, believe it or not, Giles Brandreth. No, actually, no, Giles didn't do it in the end. Christopher Biggins. So I had a mixture of political, media and entertainment people. And it was fantastic. It made no money at all, even though a lot of them were either sold out or near sold out. I think I did 24 shows and earned the princely sum of £724 for the 10 days. There's 2 shows a day. But I didn't do it for the money. I did it because I wanted to have the experience. And anyone that's done Edinburgh knows how expensive it is to put shows on. I was going to do it again this year, but obviously events intervene. Excuse me. So I think that there is an appetite out there for more direct face-to-face meetings. I used to do a theatre show called A Night with Anne Widdecombe, and we would tour regional theatres. People would pay £15 to come and see her. I'd interview her for the first half, questions for the second half, very simple format. And she jokingly said to me one day, she said, the public meeting people think is dead. I think if you charge tickets for something, people come. And if it's free, they think, well, it's of no value, so they don't bother turning up. And if you look at most election campaigns, when I stood in North Norfolk in 2003 in the election campaign, I thought I was against Norman Lamb. I think we did 3 debates across the constituency. There were probably about 100 people at each one. But I'd say probably 90 of those people had already made up their minds how they were going to vote. And they were worthwhile doing. But you did think there's an electorate of 80,000 here, and there's only 300 have actually come to see the different candidates and what they're made of. I think that is changing now, and I think the media has played a part in this, in that people are so dissatisfied with the way that media covers politics that they think, okay, well, I'm going to bypass the media and I'll go straight to the horse's mouth.
But on the other hand, there's significantly risks, it seems to me, politicians turning into entertainers. And, but part of what that does is it actually turns them into rather often, I think, exaggerated caricatures of themselves. They develop a brand, right? They become a product. They become showbiz.
And then they become Prime Minister. We know who you're talking about, Margaret.
Well, I'm also talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg, right, who's turned himself into a kind of fop as though he's harmless. But particularly, we're talking about a Prime Minister who seems to have a kind of brand and a showbiz kind of riff, but not actually to have any competence. So, is turning all of this stuff into showbiz and entertainment actually going to solve the democratic problem that we're facing?
Well, not on its own, no. Showbiz is supposed to be politics for ugly people, but politics has always involved a bit of showbiz. Lloyd George was one of our greatest prime ministers. He would have fitted in very well in today's politics because he was a bit of a ham actor. Clement Attlee would not get on in British politics today because he just wasn't willing to play that game. If someone thrust a microphone in front of him and asked him, I remember one incident, I think this is on YouTube somewhere, he'd just come back from a foreign trip somewhere and the reporter said, "Is there anything you'd like to tell us, Prime Minister?" And he said, "No, thank you." Now, sometimes you long for those days again.
I do.
Harold Macmillan, again, who, he was Prime Minister for 6 years, a real showman. But nobody, I think, nowadays would regard him in the same category as somebody like Boris Johnson. You have to play the game a bit. And if you look at...
But it's not a game. There comes a point where it isn't just... the management of a pandemic isn't a game.
No, it isn't. But I would defy anybody. I don't care whether if Theresa May was still in power, if David Cameron was in power, I would defy anybody to have been prepared for what's hit this country and indeed the world. And I think sometimes, and I think the government have made a huge number of mistakes over the past 8 or 9 months. But then so has virtually every government throughout Europe. And you look at what's going on now, and we think we've got it bad here. Well, you look at France, so they've abandoned their test and trace system, but you don't read about that in the media. They've got a curfew just introduced a curfew in big cities from 9 p.m. until 6 a.m. You don't read much about that. It's as if we are an outlier, that our government is singularly incompetent compared to others. Now, some people will definitely believe that.
The numbers would suggest that we're less competent than others. And certainly, having just come back from Italy where the numbers are strikingly lower, and having a son who lives in Germany where the numbers are strikingly lower, it's very clear that some governments are managing this better.
I'm not defending the government here, but I do think sometimes we do need to look a little bit. I interviewed Richard Bergen, the Labour MP, the other day, and his only answer to every question was the Conservatives are incompetent and Boris Johnson is stupid. Well, if that's really the level of criticism that you're going to offer, we're not going to get very far. If you can look at each individual decision that has been made, and you can see sometimes the logic for it, even if it turns out to have been the wrong decision. And at the moment, you look at the decision about not to go into a circuit breaker lockdown. Now, that is being portrayed as just ignoring the scientific advice, and it's actually not, because, of course, all that the newspapers quote is the bit where they say we recommend a circuit breaker lockdown. They ignore the bit further down the paper, which says, but we fully understand that there are other considerations here. We haven't got government by scientists. And one thing that we have learned in this pandemic is that science is not science. Science is an art, and that scientists disagree with each other just as much as economists do.
Well, science is a process, right? And of course, in a pandemic, you're getting new data every day. It seems to me like we're in Sophie's Choice every day. But I guess, my real point is that as we have politicians who are more like sort of showbiz stars, and everybody's taking up these highly polarized brands, actually, those extremes are making Britain possibly absolutely incapable of managing or governing itself. And I thought, what Jeremy Farrar said today about how this divide, this absolute lack of social solidarity is costing lives, and it's putting the country in danger. And that's, it seems to me, at heart, kind of what your book's about. But where do you see the leadership that's going to forge some kind of solidarity? Because I don't think anybody wants to go on like this.
No, I don't think anybody does want to go on like this. When you look at some of the polls that come out at the moment about what level of support there is for various policies that the government either is thinking about implementing or has implemented, it is quite remarkable that generally about 65 to 75% of people do support a lot of the individual measures that are taken. Now, as I say, some of those measures then turn out to be maybe wrong, but events are moving day by day, and they're announcing things day by day. And I can see why Keir Starmer did what he did this week and effectively stepped out of the sort of almost alliance that he and Boris Johnson had sort of built up, where the opposition did support the government. Because traditionally over the years, that is what the opposition has done in times of national crises. If you look back to the Second World War, you look back to the Falklands War, where Michael Foot, much to everybody's astonishment, supported Margaret Thatcher's actions in the Falklands War. The Conservatives supported the invasion of Iraq. Now, that turned out not to be the right decision, but it's very difficult for an opposition, I think, to break away in these times. Now, I don't believe that Keir Starmer did it just for political reasons. I'm sure there were political considerations there. I think he does believe that the government is now embarking on the wrong path. And I mean, the fact that you have got these splits is inevitably going to be reflected in the population as well. And I saw that on my programme last night when we spent 2 hours talking about all the different restrictions that were being put in place. And you can almost see it happening before your eyes, that you've got some people who think that protecting lives is just the be all and end all, and we should have a national lockdown, not just for 2 weeks, but probably for 4 months or something. And this does reflect the Brexit argument now. It's starting to, and I think you've identified something here. And then on the other side, you've got people who say, "Well, you've just got to let it rip. We just can't go on living like this." And that there is a growing frustration. And I think if the government did announce another national lockdown now, they're going to have to explain to a business in North Norfolk, where there are 19 infections throughout the whole of North Norfolk, why they're shutting their business down. And it's a totally invidious position. And it's one of the few times in my life where I thought, well, in a way, maybe it's just as well I didn't succeed in politics, because I might be having to make these decisions. And I have to tell you, I don't envy anybody who's having to make these decisions. And I think you can start to see the stresses. I mean, if you look at Matt Hancock's demeanour now, I mean, whatever you think of Matt Hancock or the Conservative Party, I mean, he's certainly got a book to write at the end of this, but you can kind of see him at the end of his tether, I think. Yeah. And I don't like to see people in that state, because you want to feel totally confident that they know what they're doing, that they're I mean, I think he probably does know more than any other politician about this, and it would be ridiculous for him to be moved in any way, I think. But I think we are in one of those situations where to say I don't know should not be frowned upon.
Yeah, I agree. How far do you think austerity polarized the country and made everybody's elbows a little sharper?
Well, I think austerity, and I'm probably going to be controversial here, is one of the most abused words in the English language, because if you actually look at the figures, we did not go through what we would traditionally know as austerity. It wasn't the austerity of the 1930s by any stretch of the imagination. Government spending did not fall, it actually rose over that period. Now, you can say, well, it didn't rise as quickly as it did before, and you'd be absolutely right on that. And there was a redistribution of the money from sort of one area to another. But if you look at the amount spent on welfare, for example, I mean, please don't tell me, even though everybody is now convinced there were widespread cuts all over the place, if you look at the actual amount of money that's spent on benefits between 2010 and 2020, it actually went up. But nobody believes that, and they will say, well, the statistics must lie. So that there were sectors of society that were more severely impacted than others during that period, and had there been a different government, no doubt there would have been a different emphasis. But if Gordon Brown had won the 2010 general election, I don't actually believe that the policies that economic policies and government spending policies would have been that different. There would have been more money spent in some areas, but then there would have been less spent in others. So politically, though, the interesting thing now is when all this is over, which, I mean, let's assume it is one day, and the day of reckoning comes for Rishi Sunak, who at the moment everyone thinks is wonderful because he's been doling out all the money. But at some stage, we have to revert to normal economic laws. And the laws of economics indicate that if you build up all of these debts, at some point they have to be paid back. And
we'll see.
Taxes, I mean, people won't stomach what they think of as austerity as the solution to this next time. So it'll be very interesting to see what kind of policies they come up with afterwards. Because even as someone who believes generally in a small state, I absolutely believe that the state has got a big role to play in the economic revival of the country after this. And there are going to be some very uncomfortable moments for people like me who would generally want to support low taxes, small state, deregulation. We're not in that era anymore.
No, we're not. One of the questions we had from one of the members of the audience, a man named Neil Batt, is the Brexit referendum divided Britain and the Scottish referendum divided Scotland. And you and I have just been having a conversation about polarization, right? Are referendums a good way or the best way to make good decisions about the future?
I think it's quite difficult to be categoric on this because there are plenty of countries in the world that have referendums quite often, and they're perfectly fine. You look at American states, and if you vote in November in this presidential election, you're not going to just be voting for the president. You'll be voting on all sorts of different referendums as whether cannabis should be legalized in a particular state. New Zealand, which is a country that we're all now told that we should seek to emulate in every possible way, they have referendums all the time. Switzerland has regular referendums. Now, I don't hear many stories from those countries saying that referendums are an inherently bad thing. I don't think it shouldn't ever be a bad idea to consult the people. Now, people will say, well, it's all very well to consult, but actually to be bound by the decision, we sometimes know better than the people, the elites will say. And it is true that referendums sometimes are held on very, very complicated issues. But I think it's difficult to say that just because the people vote a different way to maybe the media and political elites, as Donald Trump would put it, that they don't like it, that is a reason to say that referendums shouldn't happen in this country. We don't have a tradition of referendums. It was actually the Blair government that really brought those in. We had a couple before then, but we had quite a few under Tony Blair. So let's blame him.
But I think, one of the things I've been struck by is, we have this almost religious faith in democracy, but we haven't done very much to modernize it, to change it in any way. We're dealing with a political system that is really structurally virtually the same since the end of the Second World War. Do you think our Political system needs to become a little bit more flexible and adaptive and better able to respond to the changes in society? It always seems behind the game.
Well, maybe, but I'm not sure I agree with you that things are the same as they always were. I mean, devolution, as we're seeing in this coronavirus crisis, we are now seeing either the positives or the negatives of devolution, where we now have to refer to the English government, which we've never done before. There are all sorts of problems with devolution, not least the fact that England does have a democratic deficit in the devolution settlement. But if you look at the procedures in Parliament, yes, a lot of them are the same, but there have been quite a lot of modernisations over the years. The electoral system remains the same. I would say a good thing too.
Why?
Well, because I think nobody has yet come up with a system for Westminster elections that would retain the constituency element. And people love to say that politicians are out of touch. I would submit to you that the only politicians that are out of touch tend to be those that are elected by proportional representation systems, where they don't have, it depends on the system, but by and large, they don't have the constituency link. Or if they do, it's such a massive constituency, and there are multiple other members of that constituency as well, that they aren't in touch in the same way as a current member of Parliament who has 70 or 80,000 constituents, holds weekly or fortnightly surgeries, has a huge post bag. They do constituency visits to schools, hospitals, local businesses. Don't tell me that a modern day politician who's doing their job properly isn't in touch with public opinion and individuals in their constituency, because they absolutely are. They don't shout about it enough, to be frank. And I unless somebody comes up with a new system that somehow keeps that, I would not support a change in the Westminster electoral system. Local government is a different matter. I think that can be done because we have too many rotten boroughs in our country in local government, where you've got one party, generally either the Conservative or Labour Party. They've been in where I live in Tunbridge Wells. I think I'm right in saying it's been a Conservative council, maybe with one short break, since the First World War. It's appalling. It's inefficient. I think it's partly corrupt as well. you have Labour councillors all over the country in exactly the same position. That is not healthy for democracy, and that is something that a proportional system would change. And I think you can do that on a local basis. But I mean, did you know who your local MEPs were when we had members of the European Parliament? There would be probably sort of 7 or 8 or 9 in some regions. Nobody had a clue who they were or even what they did, and that was by and large because of the electoral system that elected them.
Right. I'd like to talk about something that's in the news today, because that's kind of the one part of the business that you're in. And it speaks to your theme a little bit, because we've been talking somewhat around the issue of, how did we become so angry with each other? How did we become, in a way, so mean-spirited? Right? We used to believe in sort of fair play, fair chance. Why on earth is Marcus Rashford having to campaign to persuade the government that children shouldn't go hungry?
If you put it like that, then, I mean, it's never been the case that the government of whatever colour has provided free meals for children during school holidays. I don't think it has anyway. And that surely is the job of parents to do that. Now, in extreme cases, obviously, that there is a need.
We are in an extreme case, though. We are in an extreme case where a lot of parents don't have the money, where they're financially extremely pressed, where we're looking at extremely high levels of unemployment. And are we really saying that for the small number of children?
I mean, if you look at the unemployment, the rate of unemployment is 4.5%, which is actually very low.
And nobody thinks that it's going to stay there.
No, they don't.
And we're seriously saying that in the Christmas holidays, we don't want, as a country, to ensure that kids don't go hungry. What happened to us? This is not who we used to be.
Well, I'm not defending that. If I was in the government, I would be saying, well, if this costs a few $100 million, let's not have the political row about it, because it's inevitable that, given what happened with Marcus Rashford last time, I mean, you don't have to be a political analyst to see where this is going to end. And for the government to be portrayed as having to be forced into doing something like this is never a good look.
But if the government's in touch, how does it get itself into these ridiculous situations?
Well, because they will say, well, there is a benefit system there to cater for this, that anybody that's in severe financial difficulties can claim universal benefit, universal credit. And there are all sorts of other ways. There are obviously food banks and all the. I'm not saying this is my view. I'm just saying what the government would no doubt say. But there are sometimes political battles that are not worth fighting for the sake of. I mean, given the amount of money that they have spent trying to prop things up, and I mean, one thing which, I mean, let's actually give them a little bit of credit. At the beginning of this crisis, we were told that I think there was it 1.8 million people applied for universal credit within the first 3 weeks. I mean, that figure may be wrong, but it was whatever it was. It was a substantial figure. And much to my astonishment, I haven't had in the last 4, 5, 6 months really anybody saying that they haven't been able to get universal credit. Now, I'm sure there are some people that haven't. But that system, contrary to what I was expecting, has stood up about as well as it could, I think. Now, we can all argue that, well, £94 a week isn't enough. I think they've added another £20 onto that since then. But and it's not an awful lot of money. And, of course, politicians then go into be interviewed by people like me who say, well, could you live on £5.84 an hour, Minister? Which is a fairly gratuitous question, but it's one that's always asked. So we, I think, as a society, are led by our media to always think that the worst is happening, that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, that everything is negative, and therefore every politician is incompetent. Now, there are plenty of incompetent politicians, and there are plenty of problems. But sometimes I think we ought to look a little bit deeper and recognise that people are wrestling with sometimes intractable problems which cannot be solved overnight. And there's part of me that really regrets that I never became an MP, but there's also a part of me that thinks, well, maybe I was better off out of it, because I wouldn't wish the job of an MP at the moment on my worst enemy. I have a lot of friends who are in politics, and it wasn't, for a lot of them, it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. They are abused every single day. Contrary to what people think, they're not in it for the money. And it's a pretty thankless task sometimes. We as the electorate are getting the politicians we deserve, I'm afraid. I think there is a very low calibre of politician in Parliament at the moment. You look at the cabinet and the shadow cabinet, and you could probably pick out if you combine the both of them, you could probably pick out 3 or 4 people who you would say were transformational politicians, people who could go into a government department and grip it and really effect change. But the centre, and I mean Downing Street and indeed the leader of the opposition's office, I think are wielding such a control over government and opposition now that it just snuffs out any degree of innovation, any degree of original thought. And you see it in the fact that most cabinet ministers aren't even allowed to appear on programmes like mine anymore. And it's a travesty.
The iron grip of messaging.
Yeah,
I just had a message from one of the viewers saying £94 per week is how much universal credit is now after the £20 increase, just to do a fact check. I really just had one question to close on, which you somewhat preempted, but I just wonder, the work that you do on your radio show, is that as satisfying or more satisfying than an MP's career might have been, do you think?
I think it's the best job I've ever had. I mean, if you don't listen to speech radio, take Radio 4 out of the equation here. If you've never listened to LBC, but you've kind of heard of it, you know what it is, you probably think it's sort of for white van man or cab drivers. And it is so far removed from that. It can be that kind of radio. If you're a lazy presenter and you just want to have an easy life and you start off each hour by saying, well, today we're going to talk about immigration. In the next hour, we're going to talk about abortion. In the next hour, we're going to talk about benefits. You can get a full switchboard on things like that very easily. And I mean, you are driven by the news agenda to an extent. But I like challenging my audience sometimes. And I remember saying to my producers not that long ago, right, let's do a phone-in on male rape, i.e. male on male rape. And they looked at me as if I was mad. And they said, well, who's going to phone in on that? I said, just watch. And we did it for 2 hours. Within 3 minutes, the phone lines were full with men ringing me up, telling me about their sexual assaults or rapes. And I'd done a bit of research on it, and Survivors UK say that it takes the average male who's been a victim of sexual assault, or even an attempted victim, 26 years to tell anybody else. Now think about that, the mental health consequences of that. And I get a real kick out of doing phone-ins that really challenge the audience. I get a kick out of I've been doing it for 10 years now, so there aren't that many new issues that I haven't covered before. So the day that I resort to just doing lazy phone-ins is the day that I ought to stop doing it. And I can have some influence. A lot of Conservative backbenchers say to me, well, you've got far more influence on the government than I have. If I hear, and I have done this on several occasions, if somebody rings in with a really big problem that their MP hasn't been able to do anything, I will ring up the cabinet minister and say, do you know that this is happening in your department? And what will you do about it? And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I can have influence, but I haven't got any power. The only way that you can actually change anything is to be a legislator and run a campaign and persuade the government. I mean, look at Lynn Featherstone, the former Liberal Democrat MP. If she hadn't existed, we wouldn't have equal marriage. She was the one that drove that through the coalition government. Yes, David Cameron had got behind it, and without him, it wouldn't have happened either. And he still regards that, I think, as one of his main achievements as Prime Minister. But if it hadn't been for Lynn, it wouldn't have happened. And things like that have such effects on individual people. Sometimes people imagine that politicians are sort of several layers above them, and that nothing they do or say affects their lives. Well, it does. There are so many things that you can point to where a simple change in the law has made life better for maybe only 10,000 people, but to those 10,000 people, it actually meant the earth. And we forget that sometimes. We forget it partly because politicians don't actually remind us of it enough.
So just one quick last question. Your book's called Why Can't We All Get Along? Are you optimistic we will learn again how to get along?
Well, I'm an optimistic person by nature, and I like to think that we are all fundamentally good, but have been sort of somehow led astray along the way, whether it's by the internet, whether it's by individuals. And I think we all know what is right and what is wrong. Most of our parents taught us what is right and what is wrong. And most of the time, if we are doing something wrong or saying something wrong, we know it in the back of our heads. We've just got to bring that to the forefront of our minds in future. And I mean, it is a bit like COVID. The government can do whatever it likes, but in the end, it's down to us as individuals to do the right thing. And if we all decide that we're not going to obey lockdown rules, if we all decide that we're going to put ourselves at risk, well, we know what the consequences of that will be in the end. And it's the same here in public debate. If we as individuals behave in a way that we know in our hearts is wrong, well, things are only going to get worse. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I'm perfect in this, but I like to think that I have tried to change my ways on social media. I think I do provide a reasonably good example on the radio. I did let myself down a couple of weeks ago, I will admit, where I had an absolute shouting match with a caller. And he then rang back to ask what the complaints email address was. Well, because I can't actually remember what the subject was, but he was actually saying things that were completely false. And as soon as I then tried to correct him, he would then talk over me, which you might say, well, he's on the phone, you've got a microphone, you ought to be able to. But it was just one of those situations where he wasn't willing to entertain that I could possibly have a point. And that's where it all comes back to. And it's right at the beginning of the book, I say, we all have to accept that other people have a right to another point of view. We may not agree with it, but they have a right to it. And if we don't even attempt to understand that point of view, then we're not going to be able to make our own argument properly. You have to understand your opponent's point of view in order to be able to debate with them. It's a basic rule that really ought to be fundamentally taught in schools. I don't know how much debating is taught in schools nowadays. I mean, I went to a comprehensive, we did do debates, but I just wonder nowadays whether that is being taught in sort of, I don't know, whatever they're called now, general studies lessons or whatever. The art of getting along ought to be not just taught by parents, but ought to be a core part of the curriculum, sort of, well, right through the secondary school years, I would have thought.
Great. Iain Dale, thank you so much for your conversation. You can buy a copy if you click the link at the bottom of the screen. The book is Why Can't We All Get Along? I think we got along pretty well this hour. Why can't
everyone always forgets the just.
Why can't we all just get along? I think we got along pretty well today. Thanks everybody for watching and for listening. And thank you, Iain, for your time and your conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.